Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another exciting week of Online World Civilizations 2. Now, for the rest of the semester, we're essentially going to be wrapping up the entire world and try to just very quickly summarize some of the major things that have happened in various regions of the world after the ending of the Cold War, which we talked about last week. This, of course, is going to be even more rushed than most of my stuff has been in a survey class, but I do just want to give you a bit of an idea of what the rest of the world has been up to with the Cold War now over. So, to get started, we'll look at some of the key terms in African history since the Cold War ended. First, we'll look at the New African Renaissance, we'll look at the Rwandan Genocide, we'll look at the White House Conference on African Strategy, we'll look at the African Crisis Response Initiative, and we'll look at the Second Congo War. As always, though, before we get into that, I do want to make sure you're aware of some of your important upcoming assignments. For example, your third debate, the materials will be due on November the 30th at 5 p.m. That, of course, is the case whether you participate in the live debate or whether you don't. You have between now and then to get all of your materials done and turned in, whichever assignment you do. Which by now you probably should know whether you're going to be in the live debate or doing the alternate assignment. Your final essay outline will also be due on that same day at 5 p.m. The details for this assignment, of course, can be found in the final essay prompt, which is still located on Moodle, as it has been throughout the entire semester. Finally, your fifth content quiz will be coming up the next week on December the 4th, once again, at 5 p.m. Now, if you guys have any questions about this, please do let me know as soon as possible, but I won't go too much more into detail about these assignments because I think most of us have this figured out by now. But if you do, still please feel free to run a question by me in office hours or through email, however you want to do it. But in the meantime, let's try to jump into African history a little bit. So, think about what might some of the positives of the African situation now that the Cold War is over. Very good. Once again, audience at home, I'm sure some of you who are paying attention to our last lecture on Africa might guess that it could be the lack of intervention that'll hopefully now be occurring in Africa. Might not have to worry about various coups or insurrections or sorts of civil wars being fought in the country due to conflicts over the Cold War. However, some have argued that this might lead to some downsides because the rest of the world now won't be as concerned with Africa. For example, Michael, I'm not going to try to be disrespectful and pronounce his last name, who is a Kenyan political scientist who was working at Zimbabwe, once said, "With the end of the Cold War, Africa has lost whatever political luster it may have once had, since Africa now seemed to have nothing to catapult it to the top of the global economic agenda." Essentially, the idea is that the lack of superpower involvement in Africa might also be a bit of a curse in a way. Because now Africa is essentially being, after various superpowers, including the United States and the USSR, have gotten heavily involved in Africa and helped wreck it with all these proxy wars. Now they seem to have no reason to want to get involved because they don't have to worry about getting Africa on their side of communism or capitalism anymore. So, because of this, how exactly might Africa solve this problem? Should it solve this problem and try to encourage more foreign investment and involvement? Yeah, that of course is a very tough question. We will talk a little bit about that today, and I'll leave some of the possibilities open to you. But in the meantime, we will look at some of the broken promises that did seem to suggest to Africans that the rest of the world was no longer considered in their affairs. For example, an Ethiopian civil war had occurred, which finally ended in June of 1991. According to foreign policy experts, by May of 1992, Ethiopia had still not received the promised aid the aid it was promised from Washington, D.C. In Somalia in April of 1992, Washington reduced aid to this war-torn country. So again, they're essentially cutting back on aid that they gave throughout the Cold War. Then Washington did want to try to correct this seeming mistake with Operation Restore Hope in December of 1992, but was described as being too late to prevent the peak of mortality levels. This came to a head with the infamous Battle of Mogadishu, which you can see a map of here, from October the 3rd to the 4th of 1994, which was a part of Operation Gothic Serpent to try to restore some order to this war-torn country. Which, by the way, if you want to learn a little bit more about the Battle of Mogadishu, I would highly recommend you watch the movie Black Hawk Down. Fantastic movie, which does a pretty good job of outlining this battle. But in the meantime, let's get into sort of the bigger picture by looking at international response to these issues. In 1998, in response to the issues in Africa and criticism of his handling of them, President Bill Clinton made his first official visit to 6 African nations across the continent. This was significant because it was the first official visit to Africa by a U.S. president. In this visit, he announced that Africa would now enter a new renaissance. Africa would establish a relationship with America based on equality, mutual interest, and respect, which of course sounds fantastic. However, the new African Renaissance was very quickly criticized due to some of its chief planned recipients of aid. The main ones who would receive this aid were Isaias Afwerki of a country I can't pronounce, the Ethiopian head of state, Uganda's head of state, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Couple of things that united these leaders. They all had in some form or another seized power through force. They were all publicly anti-socialist. They were all pro-market economy. And they were all pro-U.S. cooperation. So, based on this, is the African Renaissance a good thing? Very good once again, students watching at home. As you might guess, this could potentially be a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it could be seen as a good thing from a United States perspective and an international cooperation perspective because you're building relationships with leaders who are willing to work with you and are willing to support the various economic practices and international policies you're trying to pursue. So that could theoretically not just be good for the United States, but be good for the rest of the world in encouraging international cooperation. However, as you might guess, this first issue right here could be a bit of a problem for Africa itself. It also suggests that maybe, just like the Cold War, America is willing to overlook various crimes and abuses of power if they're able to build alliances with people who are pro-capitalism and anti-socialism. So again, on the one hand, it could lead to more intensive cooperation, but it also could show that maybe there hasn't really been that much of a change in America's foreign policy at all. As we go throughout the rest of this lesson, I'll of course leave that up to you. But anyway, getting into some of the problems in Africa more specifically, there was also quite a bit of genocide and various conflicts going on throughout the 1990s. For example, you have the infamous Rwandan genocide of April the 7th through the 15th, or April the 7th through the 15th of July in 1994. His estimates vary, but it's estimated that between 500,000 and over 1 million Tutsi, Twa, and Hutu ethnic minorities were killed during the Rwandan Civil War. Again, the Clinton administration was criticized for its lack of involvement. So again, one of the reasons this Renaissance was being put together is that the Clinton administration and America itself had been criticized for their lack of involvement. In this same year, the United States, from June the 26th to the 27th, the United States held a White House conference on African strategy. In this conference, the United States came up with 3 main plans of intervention. First, the United States would promote U.S. national security interests in Africa. They would employ the marketization of Africa's economies, essentially getting them involved in a global capitalist economy, and they would try to promote democracy in Africa. One of the main things that characterized all 3 of these themes of intervention was the idea that all these problems would be addressed through trade instead of direct aid. Now, is that a good idea? Which, by the way, as you might guess, is of course still a hotly debated issue today. Very good. Once again, students watching at home, this can essentially be seen as sort of a continuation of a bit of the divide between perhaps more conservative economic policies and liberal economic policies. Because on the one hand, with this whole trade instead of aid idea, the idea is that you can stimulate Africa's economy by getting them involved in capitalism instead of directly giving them aid. So the idea is that you can essentially help Africa pick itself up off of its bootstraps and become self-sufficient instead of just giving them direct aid and having them be reliant on foreign influence. So on the one hand, that could be fantastic. However, the other side would of course argue that it's impossible to get Africa really engaged in trade if you don't give them the aid to restore their economies and end some of the devastation and suffering across the continent. So again, it's essentially that age-old debate. Do you try to get a country to help itself, or do you give them direct aid to help them get off their feet so they're then able to help themselves? Again, very hotly debated issue, and we will talk a little bit about how this plan was enacted in Africa throughout the Clinton administration. So, to get into whether or not this was a successful strategy. In 2002, it was estimated that U.S. trade with Africa was only 1% of all global trade, and Africa's investment in the global U.S. economy, was less than 1% of all investment in the United States economy. So again, the idea, according to these studies, was that Africa was not really able to get directly involved in U.S. trade because they didn't have the aid able to help make this possible. So again, this would seem to suggest that the whole trade instead of aid plan wasn't quite working. However, this did seem to change a little bit with the African Crisis Response Initiative. In October of 1996, the Clinton administration established a Pan-African military intervention force dedicated to halting destabilization in Africa. Few main goals. They were going to halt U.S. national security threats, go after weapons of mass destruction, drug trafficking, and terrorism. They would also, again, improve the African economy for U.S. trade and investment. So again, we're going to invest in the economy and try to help get your economy off the ground. We're not just going to give you direct humanitarian aid. Also, they would try to prevent humanitarian disasters like the Rwandan genocide. By October of that year, 6,000 troops had been trained by the United States and supplied by them. With this intervention, there did seem to be quite a bit of optimism in Africa. Initially, the Clinton administration policies did seem to work. For example, between 1996 and 1997, 26 African countries held democratic multi-party elections. There are also a few African countries which showed significant GDP growth for the first time in a while. In this same period, there was a 3.4 annual growth in Uganda, a 5% growth in Ghana, a 6.9 growth in Uganda, and an 8.6 growth in Eritrea, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. There's also an inflation reduction. For example, Ghana inflation was down to 10% in the 1990s, when it had been as high as 60% in the 1980s. There were also 15 African stock markets created during this time, which allowed for more direct U.S. investment. By 1996, the U.S. trade with 11 African nations had netted over $9 billion in profit. This, of course, helped lead to Clinton's 1998 visit, as you might imagine, helping to lead to the optimism that called for him to set up this idea for a new African Renaissance. In his visit, Clinton stated that now the idea was not just what can we do with that, or it was not what can we do for Africa. The idea was that what can we do with Africa. So again, the idea was that by investing in Africa's trade and economy, Africa was now able to handle itself and be on equal footing with the rest of the world, and didn't need any direct aid. Now again, going back to that African Renaissance though, why might some of this prosperity not last? Once again, very good. Those of you who are paying attention, a lot of it goes back to those questionable groups the United States was supporting. Now, the plan began to seriously unravel with the Second Congo War, which lasted from 1998 to 2003. This was a conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo caused by the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide. Essentially, in this country, there was a rebellion against Mobutu, I can't pronounce his name's regime. This conflict spiraled out of control and involved 9 nations, with 8 of these nations actually having their training done by the United States. The conflict continues actually to the present day in the east of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, since I did promise that I wouldn't just focus on Islamic terrorism, and I would include a group that could potentially be considered a Christian terrorist group, I do want to focus for just a second on the Lord's Resistance Army Insurgency. This, as you can see here, is a group focused in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is active in many of these conflicts still going on today with various ethnic groups in the area. They have been active since 1987, have participated in approximately 220,000 child abductions, 1.5 million displaced civilians, and 100,000 killed just by 2004, which of course would be around the end of the Second Congo War. So again, very violent group, and as you can see here, has been accused of being participating in child soldiering. Also, the Angola Civil War resumed from 1998 to 2002, with 500,000 killed and 1 million displaced. Now, a couple of reasons arguably for the failure of this policy. As I mentioned a bit earlier, the aid that was being given to Africa was a bit unequal. For example, from 1994 to 1997, 50 African nations were receiving $2.7 billion in aid combined. During the same period, Israel and Egypt alone received $20 billion in aid. So again, Africa still didn't seem to many people to really be high on the priority list of aid from the United States. Again, the continuing support of corrupt leaders didn't help the United States very much either. For example, journalist Keith Richburg once wrote that Africa's post-Cold War leaders are hardly distinguishable from the ones they replaced. Like their predecessors, they hold phony elections, which they rig with impunity, monopolize all channels of information, intimidate, harass, and imprison their opponents or scare them into exile. Also, I feel most of these countries that we mentioned that are receiving the chief African aid all eventually would continue to have one-party states in the long term and cut back on free elections. So again, it did seem like most of these foreign policy issues were a bit ineffective. So, that leads to a question I'd like you guys to resolve in future assignments if you're able. What might be some of the long-term solutions to help to these problems in Africa? Should we try to continue a more trade and not aid scenario? Should we change a little bit of the African Renaissance but keep it around? Or should we try a whole new approach? Again, I'll leave that up to you, but as always, try to be as specific as you possibly can. In the meantime, that's all I have. Have a great rest of your week, and I will see you all, or I'll talk to you all again at some point in the future. Have a good one.